Thank you for joining us today for this very special Department of Medicine Grand Rounds. Before our Chief Resident introduces our important speaker, I wanted to preface with a few comments. The Department of Medicine has at the core of its mission the commitment to diversity of views and training our learners to be ethical physicians. We are constantly gauging our moral compass to do what's right as doctors and scientists. Today, we will hear about the most darkest hour of our society and the deplorable participation that physicians, and not just individuals, but entire medical schools and medical societies had during the Holocaust. Today's lecture coincides with the second National Holocaust Remembrance Day, which was last Friday. Many who observe Jewish traditions like myself have observed over the last 2 years a frightening and significant shift in the number and types of anti-Semitic incidents, from attacks on houses of worship, terrorism in communities, and intolerance of diversity on university campuses. But perhaps more disturbing is that in the past, those who espoused these anti-Semitic sentiments were viewed as fringe lunatics. However, today such individuals have serious power. They are wealthy individuals who wield tremendous influence. They're icons of entertainment and sports. In educating medical students, residents, and ourselves, it becomes even more important to learn from the lessons of the past so that this darkest hour of medicine will never be repeated. As we strive in our profession to be ethical and compassionate physicians to all human beings, regardless of race, religion, or sexual orientation, it is essential that we learn these lessons so that they will never be repeated again. Dr. Saul, please introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Dr. Weiss. I'm honored to introduce our Grand Round speaker, Dr. Tessa Chelouche. Dr. Chelouche is originally from South Africa and has been living in Israel for the past 42 years. She qualified at the Tel Aviv University Faculty of Medicine and is currently the head of the family medicine practice for Clalit Medical Services. For the past 18 years and continuing in the present, she has directed and taught an undergraduate course on medicine and the Holocaust at the Technion Faculty of Medicine in Haifa, Israel. She's the co-chair of the Department of Bioethics and the Holocaust of the International Chair of Bioethics, World Medical Association Cooperation Center, and is the co-director of the Maimonides Institute for Medicine, Ethics, and the Holocaust. She's also the co-editor of the Case Books on Bioethics and the Holocaust, which has been translated into 7 languages and is in use presently at numerous academic medical educational institutions worldwide. In addition, she has published numerous articles on medicine and the Nazi period and medicine and the Holocaust. She's currently a member of the Lancet Commission on Medicine and the Holocaust Historical Evidence, Implications for Today, Teaching for Tomorrow. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Chelouche to our Grand Rounds.
Good evening, all. Thank you, Dr. Weiss, for inviting me. I'm going to share my screen. Will you just let me know that it's okay? Okay. Dr. Saul, it's okay?
It's good.
Once again, thank you for this invitation. A few days ago, it was the 27th of January, and as Dr. Weiss has just said, the world commemorated International Holocaust Remembrance Day on the 27th of January. This is the day that the world, that the international community remembers the 6 million Jewish victims of the Holocaust, as well as the other victims, of course. But my story today, as a physician, is a difficult one, and it's not about Jews. I happen to be Jewish, but this is not a Jewish story. It's a medical one. And I hope by the end of my talk, you will understand what I'm referring to. As I said, International Holocaust Day is the 27th of January. And why do we celebrate on this day, or commemorate, not celebrate, sorry, is because it is the day that Auschwitz, the concentration camp in Poland, was liberated on the 27th of January. Now, when I say Auschwitz, in a talk that I'm going to say tonight, that I'm going to use tonight, many of you might think, what on earth is she going to say? When we think of the crimes of Nazi doctors, what comes to mind? What do you think about? And I'm sure that most of you think about that when we turn to the Nazi doctors in Auschwitz, it was not the experiments that were most significant. And that is probably what most of you think I'm going to talk about. When we think of Auschwitz and medicine, we think immediately of the experiments. But the story is much more complicated. As the psychologist and psychiatrist Robert J. Lifton wrote in his book, The Nazi Doctors, says, it was his participation, the medical physician, it was his participation in the killing process, indeed his supervision of Auschwitz mass murder from the beginning to the end. The experiments I am almost not going to touch on. What I'm going to tell you is the story from the beginning to the end of how medicine, our profession, my profession, was involved in these horrific events. The significance of the Holocaust for medicine is that it occurred with the intellectual support and involvement of medical and scientific establishment of the most scientifically and technologically advanced society of its time. At that time, anybody who wanted to learn or to further his studies in medicine went to one country into the world, to Germany. They had the most advanced medical and scientific establishment of the world. And this was the country that was to perpetrate the Holocaust. So for medicine, we have a special significance, as you will hear. Another topic that I'm going to talk about, and this is mainly what I'm going to discuss tonight, is that when we think of the Nazi doctors, you must think, and many of you probably think, that they had absolutely no ethics. They abandoned all form of ethic. But as the historian Proctor tells us, there is an ethic of Nazi medicine, often explicit, sometimes not. You will hear from me, this is what my talk is going to be on. Now, why do we talk about this? I'm not giving a history lesson, and this is not meant to be a history lesson. This is relevant to today because every aspect of contemporary medical ethics, of every aspect of our medical professionalism, our professional identity as physicians or as healthcare professionals, is influenced and has been influenced by this history and by the involvement of our professions in the events that led up to the Holocaust and, of course, the Holocaust itself. I'm going to debunk a few myths for you tonight. For you, it's morning. For me, it's night. The first is that very few physicians participated. Many of you might think it was only the side, it was the extreme elements of medicine that did what they did. Well, I'm going to show you that it wasn't. That they were a marginal minority, that they had to do what they were doing, that they were imposed, the Nazism was imposed on the profession, that many of them were crazy or mad. And as I said before, that they ignored all ethical codes, they were incompetent, they were forced to comply, and that the concepts of racial hygiene and eugenics were Nazi inventions. Another myth is that the experiments were pseudoscience or mad science. Another something that maybe many of you might think was that most of the physicians, as other Nazi perpetrators, paid the price and were tried and sentenced after the war. That is also a myth. And the main message today for me and for all of us is that this history is completely irrelevant. As I talk, every slide that I show, I would like you to think of the elements that I'm going to discuss in every slide. You can actually think of medicine today and ethics today. In 1946, one of the very first trials after the war, one of the very first Nuremberg trials was a doctor's trial. It was a medical trial where 20 physicians and 3 medical administrators were held responsible and tried for crimes against humanity. The main defendant at this trial was Karl Brandt, who was one of Hitler's personal physicians, stated these words: "If this Hippocrates were alive today, he would formulate his oath differently." And that is exactly what happened. Hippocrates was not ignored, and they didn't throw Hippocrates out in Nazi Germany. They used Hippocrates, they just formulated it differently. Were they pawns or pioneers? 50% of the German doctors were members of the Nazi Party. They didn't have to become members of the party, they had a choice. Look at the other professions: 22% of teachers, 24% of musicians, 25% of the lawyers, but 50% of the medical physicians in Nazi Germany chose to be members of the party. Mainstream medicine was involved. Most of them were involved in some way or another. This might seem completely surprising to many of you, but the Nazis were the first in the world to teach medical ethics at medical schools. In fact, they had the first ethics course that was compulsory for medical schools in Nazi Germany. At all medical schools in Germany, the course was compulsory. The man in the picture is a family physician, just like myself, who led this course in Berlin and later published a textbook, as you can see there on the slide, that has been recently translated into English. This was the textbook that they used, of the lectures that they used for this course at all Germany's medical schools. Every single medical school who went through Nazi Germany heard this course and participated in this course. And during my talk, I'm going to use a lot of passages that Rudolf Ram, his name is Rudolf Ram, the man who wrote this book. I'm going to use a lot of his passages to explain to you, for us to try and understand what was going through their heads. What were the students being taught? What were their teachers teaching them, because they believed that this was the right thing to do? Now, as we know, ethical teaching does not take place in a vacuum, not in any country and not today. We know that culture, race, and spirit of the times affect a physician's values and manner of engaging with previous problems according to the standards of the time. That sounds pretty reasonable and normal to what we would actually think today. Ethics does not take place in a vacuum. It always depends on society, on politics, on culture, on economics. And it did so also in Nazi Germany. So what was this race and culture and spirit of the times? First of all, they believed that the physicians had a major role in society. And once again, I'd like you to think of today's role as well. As health leaders, they were going to create a society where Germany could recover after the First World War. And in his text, Rams writes the words that the victory of the National Socialist Revolution is also meant for the medical community the breakthrough of a new attitude of mind. From this day forward, the Nazi takeover, of course, important regulations concerning the profession were no longer to be made by majority decisions, but by the leadership principle. This was what they believed. Health professionals were now leaders, health leaders in society. And the man in the photograph here is not from a tabloid and not from a political journal or article or newspaper. It's from a medical journal. He was the head of the German National Social Physician League, the head of basically the Nazi German Physicians Association. You can see how he's dressed. So they were going to leave the country. Their duty was to the nation. The physician must work for the welfare of the folk and the Reich. No longer was the ethic to the individual patient, but it was a collective ethic. This replaced basically the old ethic, of course, that had been around for thousands of years, that we have a duty to each and every patient. Now in Nazi Germany, the students were taught that it was their duty to the nation. That was their first and foremost duty. So we have this kind of juxtaposition of position of loyalty. Who were they to be loyal to? There was no question in Nazi Germany. First came the state. As I said before, they didn't throw Hippocrates out. They did not abandon Hippocrates. They used Hippocrates, and Ram makes it very clear to his students that Hippocratic values are essential to the profession. But it depended on which sector of society you belonged to if they were going to uphold Hippocratic ethics or not. They recognized Hippocratic ethics as perpetual, like those already laid down, and they were estimable medical ethics up to the present time, but it really depended on which part of the society you belonged to if you were going to be treated according to Hippocratic ethics in Nazi Germany. He writes in his text, and they taught the students in many forms of Hippocratic values that we still recognize today, of course, that a physician should not use any therapeutic technique that he himself has not mastered, that he is to use the best means of healing at his disposal, and that a physician is to be vigilant with the use of highly potent medical modalities and poison. Now, this was pretty ironic in his text, as you will hear later, because while they were teaching the students that every doctor has to be vigilant with his use of highly potent medical modalities and poisons, they were actually doing that in that very same act, just to certain sectors of the population. As I said, selective ethics, it all began with basically a dehumanization. And they taught their students that their ethical, how were they going to become obliged to the folk and not to the individual patients, that certain individual patients, by basically dehumanizing them. By those, they considered them to be a danger to the genetic health of society. Certain people who had a genetic value basically were going to be dehumanized so that they could be marginalized, selected out. Bad genes, they started talking about bad genes. And Ram teaches his students all about bad genes, that the duty of the doctor now is the preservation and improvement of the genetic predisposition to the nation. And how are they going to improve this genetic wealth of the nation was to eradicate a mass of bad genes. So they start talking about preservation of blood and bad genes, and they teach their students this, of course, as well. Now, it didn't start in Nazi Germany. Bad genes, the whole theory of bad genes did not begin with the Nazis. It began in the Western world, in Britain, in the United States. The man in the photograph here is basically Francis Galton, who is a cousin to Charles Darwin, who coined the term eugenics with the idea that science deals with the improvement, medicine deals with the improvement of the hereditary qualities of the human race. By the third decade of the 20th century, the belief in science as a tool to reform and advance society was accepted, and it was a popular worldwide social and scientific movement. There were international eugenics movement conferences in days where they didn't have Zoom like we do today. There were international movements in England, in Sweden, in Brazil. These are just very, very few examples of countries who had very, very virulent international eugenics movements. There were conferences, as I said before. The first eugenics conference was held in London in 1912, second one in New York in 1921, and the third once again in New York in 1932. They compared their scientific research on eugenics. Some of the leading eugenicists in the world were names that some of you might recognize. Leonard Darwin was the son of Charles Darwin. Winston Churchill took place at the conference in London. Alexander Graham Bell participated as well. And of course, there were German eugenicists at these conferences as well. And America, as is so common in many things, America was at the head they were leaders in the eugenics movement. They had experimental stations, they had research stations, and they were also very active in applying these eugenic beliefs. In 1907, Indiana was the first state to pass sterilization laws. This was their way of eradicating bad genes. The 1924 American, as I said, they passed sterilization laws. I'll show you here in this slide. All the states that are marked here in black are states that had laws. This was a legal program whereby from 1907 until the 1960s, 60,000 people in the states had been sterilized. And who were they sterilizing? Well, basically, the categories are on the left, as you can see, all kinds of social and physical and mental misfits, or people who are unfit for society, feeble-minded, which is a category that, of course, has no real clear definition. Paupers, inebriate, alcoholics, criminals of all descriptions, epileptics, insane, as what they said, constitutionally weak, predisposed to certain diseases, and of course, physically deformed. And what they considered then in those years to be completely hereditary was deaf, blind, and mute people. So those were people who were sterilized against their will in the United States. One of the most well-known cases to come before the Supreme Court in the United States was the case in the picture here. This is Carrie Buck, who is an unwed young girl in the state of Virginia who was raped by a family member who she was living with because her mother, who is also in the photograph here, was institutionalized at the time because she was probably slightly mentally retarded. But Carrie was a normal girl, 17 years old, living in a kind of foster home with relatives, and she was raped there and she had the misfortune to fall pregnant. And her doctor deemed her necessary and applicable to be sterilized because they did not want further generations of people like Carrie to have children. And this case went to the Supreme Court in the United States in 1927 when the judge, part of his judgment was that 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. And Carrie was sterilized. The 1924 American immigration laws are based on eugenic principles. They took eugenicists to advise them on to who was worthy or which people it was better for to accept into the United States and which people it was better to keep out of the United States. Intelligence testing was also developed with eugenic principles in mind, and a lot of research was done on immigrants to test to formulate the intelligence testing, development of intelligence. And of course, Germany was no different. In Germany, they had a very flourishing eugenics movement, basically, where once again, after World War I, they had been defeated. There were millions of people dead. The country was in dire straits. There was economic unemployment, reparations they had to pay. Millions of soldiers were dead. And the sick were considered basically to be a real economic and social burden on society. So they start talking about bad genes in Germany, of course, as well. Now they look to America. They basically were influenced largely by America, the Germans. You can see here a photograph. It's to put together basically where the German Eugene Fischer, the director of one of the most prestigious research institutes at the time, the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Anthropology, Human Genetics, and Eugenics, is superimposed on Charles Davenport, who was an American eugenicist. The Germans took a lot of knowledge about eugenics and praised the Americans, and basically took a lot of support from the American eugenicists before World War II. So they start talking about, as I said, bad genes, or another term that was used was life unworthy of life. And this was taken from paper that was published, a research book basically that was published by a physician and a lawyer, German in 1920, in Germany in 1920, where they proposed the most radical solution to the problems basically posed by institutionalized disabled patients in Germany. And they titled their work "The Authorization or Allowing the Destruction of Life Unworthy of Life." In other words, what to do with those in society who were deemed basically unworthy of life. And drawing on eugenics, they introduced this idea that called for the legalization of mercy killing for the mentally or intellectually dead who were perceived as being a social and economic burden of society. Now, racial hygiene, they called eugenics in Germany racial hygiene, and it was all ethically rationalized. This was all justified ethically from a medical ethics point of view. It was all rationalized. As one of the leaders, the grandfather basically of racial hygiene in Nazi Germany, the man in the photograph here, Fritz Lenz, told his profession. The individual personality cannot be the final goal of ethics. Once again, stressing this loyalty to the state. The people as an organism is the goal of our ethics. So this was basically ethically justified. And of course, we can see that race is coming into part now. That's beginning to call eugenics in Germany was not called eugenics, it was called racial hygiene, because it was basically, they took eugenics and used the eugenic motive for their racial hygiene beliefs, political beliefs, and of course, medical. Scientifically, they tried to prove the differences between the races. There was a huge amount of research performed to try and prove the differences between the races. And basically, they looked to Adolf Hitler, to the politics of Nazi Germany, as they thought it was a fantastic chance for medicine to basically go forward in this path, because they were basically talking the same language. And a lot of medical analogies were used in the political on political platforms, in the literature, in the newspapers, in the propaganda. They used a tremendous amount of medical analogies, as you can see here in the propaganda poster on the screen, where they told the people that these people, like the person sitting there who was obviously a disabled person, he was costing the country or costing the people a lot of money. They used a lot of medical analogies in propaganda. And the propaganda, as you can see here at the Minister of Propaganda, Goebbels, one of his statements was, "Our starting point is not the individual, and we do not subscribe to the view that one should feed the hungry, give drink to the thirsty, or clothe the naked. Our objectives are entirely different. We must have a healthy people in order to prevail in the world." This was a language that was very appealing to the medical profession. So that eventually what we actually begin to see is that racial hygiene and Nazi policy could not be differentiated. They were talking the same language. Nazism was seen basically as applied biology. You can see here, as I showed you already, the photograph of the German head of the Medical Association, but on the right is the medical newspaper, which is the equivalent to the New England today, it would be, with the Nazi symbols and signs on the head cover of an issue that was issued in July 1933. As I said, there was a symbiotic relationship between these two, between Nazism and medicine. And Hitler knew that he would need the profession to do what he wanted to do. In one of his earliest speeches at Nuremberg, he calls to the physicians and he says that he can do without the lawyers and without other professions. But he says, you National Socialist doctors, I cannot do without you, not for a single day or a single hour. He knew very well, the politicians knew, that in order to carry out the programs that I will tell you about, that they had in plan, they could not do it without the cooperation, the full cooperation of the medical profession. Now, of course, anti-Semitism, which has been around for thousands of years, and unfortunately, as we heard from Dr. Weiss, we are still, of course, evidencing today, anti-Semitism flourished during those years in Germany, which, of course, was a part of the, which was inherent to and the main part of course, the Nazi policy, but it didn't fly over the medical profession at all. In fact, it was inherent to the medical profession. From the beginning to the end, the Nazi solution to the Jewish question was a medical one. Anti-Semitism was taught at medical schools. Part of his book, a large part of this textbook is devoted to teaching the students that anti-Semitism is okay now, that it was good that the profession got rid of cleansing, as he says here, cleansing of the profession of politically unreliable and racially foreign elements. The anti-Semitic laws that were passed in Germany were seen as public health laws. The German medical profession was very pleased that many Jewish doctors lost their jobs. They were considered politically unreliable and racially foreign to the profession. And this was what the students were taught in the ethics textbook. So that we have anti-Semitism as an integral part of medicine in Nazi Germany. And as the rest of the world, we also have sterilization laws. They saw that the rest of the world was doing sterilization, was sterilizing the patients who were deemed unworthy of living or unfit to live or unfit to procreate. And so in Nazi Germany, one of the earliest laws that they passed is a sterilization law. This is a legally accepted law. It is even formulated by German physicians. This was not imposed on the profession. This stemmed from the profession. This was what they believed this was to be their duty. And so, as in other countries, we have Nazi Germany passing a law in 1933. They have special courts. The photograph on the right is a court. The judges in the courts who were going to try these cases of sterilization. They had about 230 courts, I think there were, where the judges on the courts were also physicians. And of course, physicians were the people who had to report on these patients, of course, without any consent or any knowledge, but on the part of the patients. So we have physicians going through files, as you can see here on the screen, going through files, reporting their patients that they thought were deemed eligible for sterilization to courts where other physicians were judges on these courts. And of course, the majority of cases were passed and the people were basically sterilized against their will and even with force. Once again, this is all ethically justified. It is highly unethical, says Ernst Ruden, the director of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Psychiatry in Munich, to inhibit the unhealthy in order to open up the field of reproduction to the healthy. This is what we've got to do. If we want healthy people to reproduce, we have to deal with the unhealthy. So basically, this is ethically justified as what is right for medicine to do. And in the end, we have about 365,000 German citizens were sterilized against their will and without their knowledge. Rab teaches his students that the genetic health of the coming generation depends on the physician's conscientious application of the law. In 2019, just 4 years ago, one of the last victims of the Nazi sterilization passed away in Germany at the age of 102. She had one psychotic episode in her life, and so she was institutionalized and sterilized at a very young age, at 19. She then became a sculptor and an advocate for more humane psychiatric care in modern Germany. Now, the Nuremberg laws were laws passed in 1935 in Nazi Germany to basically prevent the mixing of blood between non-Aryans and Aryans. And they were seen by the medical profession as public health laws. They were they were seen as defining biologically the definition of who is a Jew, a quarter Jew, a half Jew, or a whole Jew. And Ram, we can see that he teaches his students that the Nuremberg laws are milestones on the way towards re-winning racial unity. This was considered completely acceptable within the medical profession in Nazi Germany, to define certain people as Jews because of their genetic makeup. Now, Nazi Germany, ironically, I don't want to talk too much about this, but as I said, it was one of the leading medical establishments in the world, and they had, in actual fact, extremely developed public health measures in place that almost no other countries had at the time. They were very against alcohol. They were very against tobacco. They forbid smoking in public places, and they had one of the most forward breast cancer detection movements in the world. Just to mention these, there were many other campaigns that were excellent public health. They certainly were not backward in the way they looked at public health. It just depended, once again, who you were among citizens of the country, whether you were going to receive the public health, the treatment, the correct treatment that was deemed correct for the country. Half the Nobel Prizes for science and for medicine during those years came out of Germany. They really had a very, very clear conception of what public health was, what medicine was, and what racial hygiene was. They were not backward at all. Now, eugenics had a positive side and a negative side. Positive, obviously, they wanted more and more people who looked like these people in the picture to reproduce, and for the future generations to look like them. And this was what the medical students were taught as well, that it was the physician's duty to induce the genetically healthy, high-valued family. This was what the students were taught. This was going to be their duty to their patients, basically, to see to it that the country had more and more people who were biologically valuable. Now, they even gave crosses out to German mothers who had a lot of healthy-looking children like the ones that I've just showed you. Here is a photograph of a German mother wearing a cross of honor because she had healthy children. She got a silver cross for 4 children, a bronze cross for 6 children, and a gold cross for 8 children. There are thousands of these crosses lying in homes in Germany today. Abortion, of course, was also another aspect that they dealt with, that they had laws for in Nazi Germany. A healthy Aryan woman was forbidden completely to have abortions because they wanted more and more healthy, of course, German babies. But and then they taught their students as well that this is what he writes in his text, that whoever weakens the folk community through abortion of a fetus is to be placed on the same plane as a traitor to the country and the folk. In the same way that abortion was forbidden for healthy German women, contraception was also forbidden for healthy German women, even if you weren't married. It was completely against the law. But they modified the sterilization law later, that if for people who were sterilized and later, or same people that were deemed eligible to be sterilized, they were forced to have abortions. So once again, it depended which sector of society you belonged to, whether the laws applied to you or not. And then we get to the most difficult part to talk about, which is euthanasia. And I put it in inverted commas because, of course, it has absolutely nothing in common with what we would what we would name today euthanasia. But in Nazi Germany, this was the term that they used. And Ram asks his students in his textbook, he asks, is the ethical duty of the physician to give through some intervention or means release from incurable suffering? Which of course is what euthanasia is. In Greek, euthanasia means a good death. And he asks his students basically, is this our duty? Now in Nazi Germany, euthanasia was basically used and was it was a euphemism for murder. The medical profession was completely, this was one of the medical programs that was developed as a practical program to deal with the people who were unworthy of living. And it began with the children. This was never a legal program. This was never law. It wasn't passed. The doctors wanted it to become a law, but it did never become a legal program. Rather, it was the doctors had a choice. They could do this or they didn't have to do it. In 1939, the Reich Ministry circulated a decree requiring that all physicians, nurses, and midwives report newborn infants under the age of 3 who showed signs of severe mental or physical disability. These forms were later sent to experts in other offices, and they developed about 30 or 35 special wards in Germany for the specific purpose of murdering these children whose lives were deemed unworthy of living. They were killed with overdoses or lethal injections. The actual killing was often done, mainly done, in fact, by the nurses in these wards. And the program later expands to what we call today T4 adult euthanasia program, which was the murder in the hospitals of between 250 to 300,000 disabled, physically and mentally disabled adults. They were transferred from their institutions to special institutions in Nazi Germany that were created for the single and sole purpose of murder. On the screen is a picture of a gas chamber. Gas chambers are usually connected, or we associated them with a concentration camp. The gas chamber in the photograph here is one that I took about a year ago at Hadamar Institution, which was a euthanasia hospital, still is a hospital today, a psychiatric hospital. It's in the basement of the hospital. They built these special gas chambers where the doctors oversaw this whole process, and they actually murdered the patients who were hospitalized in these institutions. The physicians determined when they would be killed, how they would be killed, and they experimented on the best methods to kill these patients. They operated this whole process together with the nurses, and they then determined and pronounced the deaths of the patients in places like this. False death certificates were sent to the members of the families of the patients who were hospitalized to inform them that their loved ones had passed away in the hospital. As I said, this was not a legal program. Doctors had a choice, and there are examples of heads of institutions and other physicians, very few examples, but we do have examples of people who resisted and did not participate in this program, and nothing happened to them. Once again, this is all ethically justified. One of the directors of an institution that was that participated in the murder of patients was the man in the photograph, Dr. Herman van Muller, who writes that as a director of a mental hospital, I believe it is appropriate for us doctors to grasp the importance of eradicating life unworthy of life. So Ram, when he teaches his students, this is what they're teaching. The problem of euthanasia extends, however, to people afflicted with intellectual and physical genetic illnesses who can never develop normally. He says these creatures will merely vegetate and constitute a serious burden on the national community. And they are taught that these people only not only reduce the standard of living for the rest of their families, but they also need a healthy person to take care of them. In other words, this is a huge economic burden on society, and it's now up to us, the medical profession, to take care of this problem in society. So why this euthanasia program, why do we stress it so much, and why do we talk about it other than it was so horrific and it was actually medical murder, is that in another way, it connects us to what was to come. In many ways, there are connections. It was not a step-by-step process. And of course, the Nazi murder of millions of people probably would have taken place. We don't know it, but I would probably say without the medical profession. But the fact is that it did take place with the participation of the medical profession. And there are very, very vivid links in the chain between the euthanasia program, which has its basis on the sterilization program, which is based on eugenics, racial hygiene, and the subsequent genocide. Some of the links are what I'm going to tell you now. When the euthanasia program was being performed, the concentration camps were beginning to be built. But people who fell ill in the concentration camps, they didn't have gas chambers ready for them in the concentration camps yet. And so they had to do something with the sick workers, the prisoners who were in the early concentration camps. They sent them out of the concentration camps back to Germany to be murdered in the T4 euthanasia centers. So the physicians travel backwards and forwards and give advice, basically, special physicians on who was to be murdered and how they were going to kill them. And then they transport them into Germany, into the euthanasia centers. There was one, by the way, in Austria, the rest were all in Germany. And they were murdered in the gas chambers. And this was called the Special Treatment 14F13 because of the bureaucracy behind this. But it was a code name, basically, for the very early prisoners to be murdered. They were not murdered in the camps. They were murdered in the T4 hospitals in Germany. Another link is that there were, of course, these programs, the sterilization program and the euthanasia program, were not racial programs. They were not Jewish or anti-Jewish programs. But Jewish patients were murdered not because they were very ill or very disabled, but just because they were Jewish. We have records of about 5,000 Jewish patients who you can see here on the slide were marked as Jews on their medical records. And they were murdered in many cases just because they were Jewish. So this is another link between the euthanasia program and what we know today as the final solution or the genocide of the Jews and the other minorities. And then we have a very chilling link, is that the man in the photograph here is a medical doctor. His name is Imfried Erbel, and he was very active in 2 euthanasia centers in Germany, and they took his expertise and his knowledge and made him the first he was at the photograph shows here Brandenburg Killing Center, which is where he worked and where he about 10,000 patients were murdered in this center. And Erbel was later to become the first commander of Treblinka. He is the only medical physician who was to ever hold such a high position in an extermination camp, basically. But Erbel was the first commander of Treblinka, and he was sent to Treblinka because of his expertise and experience in T4. He was also expelled because he didn't do the job well enough. He couldn't dispose of the bodies quickly enough at Treblinka, and so he was actually sent away quite early. But he was chosen because of his experience in murdering people, a medical doctor once again. So as I said, you can see the links in the chain. It's not one program that directly leads to the other, but there are links, and this is why it's important to discuss, of course, all this in the same breath between the gas chambers in the hospitals in Germany, which, by the way, are still in existence, of course, as museums today, and you can visit them and see it, and the gas chambers in the extermination camps like the one here in Auschwitz. It's pretty chilling to just imagine that a gas chamber like the one here exists in a hospital. And of course, the experiments, which I'm not going to talk about, which I'm sure you thought I was going to talk about, but I'm not. I just want to say that once again, they were not performed by crazy, mad scientists, and they were certainly not only performed in the concentration camps. Almost every medical institution in Germany was involved in research on people. Not all the experiments were incredibly cruel, but many of them were. Today, there is a special project, a historical project that is being done to try and recognize these people who were experimented on. We know of more than 200 experiments that took place throughout Germany and the occupied territories. About 30,000 victims have been identified today. And of course, most of the people who survived suffered long-term health effects, and they received little or no compensation for their suffering under the hands of the Nazi doctors in the past. Going back to the Nuremberg trial, which I said was one of the earliest, it was the second trial to be held in Nuremberg after the very, very big, famous first Nuremberg trial. 20 doctors and 3 medical administrators put on trial. It was pretty evident that it became evident that at the trial that these doctors never apologized. They never voiced any expression of remorse. The exact opposite. They tried to rationalize whatever they had done in ethical rationalizations. For example, they used ethical justifications for their actions, saying that it made no sense not to risk the lives of a couple of 100 men when 1,000 German soldiers were dying of typhus every day on the Eastern Front. Never apologized, Gerhard Rose, as the others as well. One of the things at the medical trial, and this is a very, very harsh statement, but is one that is impossible not to think about today when you realize the history of how medicine had participated in what I've just told you, is that the AMA, the American Medical Association representative at the Nuremberg trial, it was an American-held trial, and they had American Medical Association representatives and expert witnesses at the trial. He made this statement: had the profession, our profession, medicine, taken a strong stand against the mass killing of sick Germans before the war, it is conceivable that the entire idea and technique of death factories for genocide would not have materialized. Andrew Ivy made this statement in 1946. It's pretty scary to think about that today, but it's inevitable. What would have happened if somewhere along the line, the medical profession had said no? At the trial, what was interesting was that there were no principles in the world for experimentation on human beings. Very, very quickly, the Americans recognized this and ran home. They sent Andrew Ivy back to Chicago, where the American Medical Association, while the Nuremberg medical trial was going on, formulated the principles of ethics concerning the experimentation in human beings. And they published these regulations or principles in the JAMA of December 28, 1946. This was just a couple of weeks after the trial began, when they realized that there were no actual formulated principles in America for human experimentation. But where there were principles of ethics concerning experimentation was in Germany. In fact, in Germany,
3 minutes. Sorry, Dr. Toon, we have 3 minutes left.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Okay. There were existing guidelines on human experimentation in Germany. They just completely ignored them. We don't know for what reason, but there were guidelines that were even more explicit than what we received from what we know today as the Nuremberg Code, which is the code is what we received from in Nuremberg. I'm going to skip the rest of the, maybe I'll do it very quickly. Why this is so important is that after the war, the new our Hippocratic Oath, which had been around for so many years and which even Rudolf Ram, as I said, used in his textbook, it had to be changed after the Second World War because of what had transpired. And we received a new section of the Hippocratic Oath, which was the considerations of religion and nationality, race and party politics were not to come between the doctor and his patient. The Hippocratic Oath, which had been around for thousands of years, was now changed because of what had transpired in medicine during the Nazi world. Now, it was the medical world was silent, of course, as the world was in general, and these codes were seen as necessary for barbarians, but unnecessary for ordinary physicians. But as I say, the present-day medical codes have their origins in Nazi Germany and in the Holocaust. They do not say so specifically, but the Nuremberg Code of 1947 is basically the basis. It forms of what we have. It's the basis of what we have today, which is known as the Declaration of Helsinki. As I said, the Declaration of Geneva, which is the new Hippocratic Oath, was also based on what had transpired. And other medical ethical principles are all based on this history, even if they don't explicitly say so. Have we learned the lessons of the Nuremberg trial? I'll leave it up to you to think about this. Have we learned, has the world learned the lessons of the Nuremberg trial? With a big question mark. Once again, the significance of the Holocaust for us, for medicine, is that it differs from the other forms of genocide in that it was a genocide that involved the active participation of medicine and science. And this is the reason I think why we should teach it today, why we should teach every medical student, every young doctor who's going to practice medicine, is that our profession is the history of the profession and what had happened during this era. And I'll end here to keep time.
Wow, that was incredible. Thank you so much for the insight. Although many of our doctors in the audience need to go to clinic and have other responsibilities, I'll leave the chat open and the discussion open. And Dr. Carrasquillo, if you're still on the thing, I know you left a message in the chat. Ovine, if you'd like to unmute yourself and sort of ask your question briefly. I think Dr. Chelouche may have some insight based on history.
Thank you, Roy. Absolutely amazing talk. You have no idea how many people have been texting, exchanging comments, talk. But the question is basically, as said at the beginning, we see the start of this already happening in Florida. A lot of these racist initiatives having very racist overtones led by your governor. But he's very vindictive. It is very hard to speak up. He's made it clear he will go after you. So think about our institutions that get money from the state. Our faculty were very afraid, getting demoted, getting fired over this. So it's very hard. We get hundreds of millions of dollars from the state here at the University of Miami. Think how hard it would be for anyone here to speak up against this. What can or should we do in that kind of a setting where you have very vindictive leadership going after anyone who speaks up against this?
So, Dr. Chelouche, based on the historical events in the 30s and 40s, the doctors that were dissidents, how were they dealt with, and what do you have any advice today?
I've got the same questions that you all have. Of course, we don't aim to provide the answers. The aim is to make us as medical professionals think and ask the questions, of course, and especially the young ones. There were dissidents, not many, very, very few people who refused, chief heads of departments, senior doctors who refused. Nothing happened to them. They continued their work. And as I said, 50% of the profession were members of the party, but 50% were not, which is, something to be remembered as well. I certainly am not here to provide the answers. I'm here so that to make people question. That's the
right. We don't expect you to.
Of course
if
not.
If you had the answers, we would like you president. But
yeah, exactly.
We totally get that.
The other side, of course, which we haven't talked tonight, which is a whole nother talk, is the other side. And it's not it's not one side against another. It's not black against white, because there's a very big gray zone. But I didn't talk tonight, which was which is another whole aspect of medicine and Nazi Germany and medicine and the Holocaust, and that is of the Jewish doctors or the prisoner doctors who were physicians and nurses in the camps and in the ghettos. And of course, many of them were, they resisted. They did everything they could to resist the deal that the cards that they'd been dealt basically with. It's not to say that it was there's no heroes and villains. There was a big gray zone. There's a big gray zone, but that's another talk. I mean, we didn't talk about those doctors at all tonight because it's just today because it's impossible to talk about everything. But we must remember that there was another side to our profession that's important to remember, and those are the prisoner doctors. Not all of them Jewish, many of them Jewish, most of them the survivors, the ones that we have their memoirs or their testimonies from, who did show us another side of our profession.
Yes, Dr. Chelouche, we'll have to have you back and give that side of the story as well. I think that the very important message here is if we don't learn about the past, we're destined to repeat it, as many have said. And many medical schools now have started formal curricula on this. There was a very interesting webinar last week by the AAMC, where medical schools are having visits to Germany to actually see firsthand what happened there, and it becomes part of the curriculum. Because there clearly has been repeats. One could argue whether it was at the same level as what was seen. Nothing can be as horrific as that, but certainly has come very close in many areas. And I also, I'm welcome to leave the mic open and people can mention things. I'm glad to see Ms. Horowitz here from the Holocaust Memorial in Miami Beach. And those of you who are on the call who haven't had an opportunity to visit the Holocaust Museum here in our own backyard, I think it's very worthwhile to do so. So thank you all for attending this very provocative and interesting Grand Rounds, which I hope we all have learned from. And I'll leave the chat open and the mic open if anyone has any comments. And Dr. Chelouche, thank you so much for this important talk.
Thank you. I know it's difficult to talk to. I just want to tell you that we do have a very, very important mission going on, which is the Lancet Commission. The Lancet, we are a group of 20 basically researchers, some of us medical, some of us historians, who are, we are forming a report on medicine and the Holocaust because we believe that this should be taught at medical schools or healthcare professional schools all over the world. It's not, it's a universal issue, and there's a lot to be learned because there are parallels and there are continuities for the present.
Thank you.
The critical factor was eugenics, correct?
Absolutely.
That's what led to everything.
Eugenics and anti-Semitism, basically. Together, they blended.
And anti-Semitism is
Okay.
the root of it. Yeah.
They blended.
I don't know. Are there any more comments in the chat? I can't see them. Dr. Lenz mentions teaching this in high schools as well. Dr.
Absolutely.
Rosenblatt, thank you. And your CME credits are listed there. Okay, so thank you all very much again for attending today's session, and I wish everybody good health, a higher level of social consciousness. And remember that if you do object, none of these doctors that objected got into any trouble. So just think about that.
Moral courage.
Thank you. Yes. All right.
Madame.
Thank you.